Palermo, Sicily, January 15th, 1993. It's a cold morning, and the city is choked with the mundane chaos of rush hour traffic. On a congested street, a white Citroën sits idling, trapped like any other car. But this is no ordinary commute. In an instant, unmarked police vehicles surge forward, boxing the Citroën in. Elite Carabinieri officers, faces set like stone, move in. From the car emerges a man who could be anyone's grandfather. He is 62 years old, short and paunchy, with the weathered look of a peasant. He is Salvatore Rina, known to his underlings as Ucurtu, the Short One, and to his enemies, and the world, as La Belva, the Beast. For 23 years, he has been a ghost, the most wanted man in Italy, the undisputed. Capo dei Capi, the boss of all bosses of the Sicilian Mafia. And now his reign is over. He surrenders quietly, without a fight, even offering a compliment to his captors. This anticlimactic moment is the decapitation of the most violent, powerful, and feared criminal organization in the Western world. This man, and the clan he led from the hardscrabble town of Corleone, had waged a war not just against rival mobsters, but against the very heart of the Italian state. He had ordered the assassinations of its most courageous judges, its most dedicated police officers, and its most defiant politicians. His capture was a monumental victory, a moment of catharsis for a nation pushed to the brink. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the end of a single, bloody chapter in a saga that began over a century before, in the sun-scorched fields and fragrant lemon groves of a newly formed and broken land. To understand how this one man could bring a modern European state to its knees, we have to go back. Back to the very beginning, to understand the soil from which this poisonous tree grew. This is the story of the Sicilian Mafia. This is the story of Cosa Nostra, the unruly garden birth of the Mafia. To understand the Mafia, you must first understand Sicily. It is an island at the center of the world, a strategic prize coveted and conquered for millennia. The Phoenicians came, then the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Spanish. For centuries, the Sicilian people were not masters in their own house. They were subjects, ruled by a long line of foreign invaders who were often hostile and always distant. This history forged a unique Sicilian character, a deep and abiding suspicion of central authority. The state was not a protector. It was an occupier, a tax collector, an alien force to be resisted and deceived. Justice was not something you sought from a courtroom in a faraway capital. It was something you handled yourself within the family, within the village. This instinct for self-protection, for a parallel system of justice, gave rise to a powerful cultural code, Omerta, the code of silence. It was not a criminal invention. It was a survival mechanism, an ancient belief that a person should never go to the government for help and never cooperate with its authorities, no matter the crime. This profound mistrust was the fertile ground in which the Mafia would plant its seeds. The critical moment came in the 19th century, a period of immense upheaval. In 1812, Sicily formally abolished feudalism, shattering a social order that had stood for centuries. For generations, the island's vast agricultural estates, the latifondi, had been owned by an absentee aristocracy who lived in the comfort of Palermo or Naples. They enforced their will through private armies and managed their lands from afar. Then, in 1861, Sicily was annexed into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy. But the new Italian state was a foreign power of a different kind. It was weak, inefficient, and utterly incapable of imposing order on an island it barely understood. With fewer than 350 active policemen for the entire population, many towns had no permanent police presence at all, leaving criminals to operate with impunity. The abolition of the old feudal order and the failure of the new state to replace it created a catastrophic power vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped a new and formidable figure, the Gabellotto. The Gabellotti were rural entrepreneurs, a rising middle class who leased the massive estates from the disinterested aristocrats. They, in turn, would sublet parcels of land to the peasants who worked it. The Gabellotto became the true power in the countryside. He was the landlord, the employer, and the law. to protect the estates from bandits and to keep the peasant workforce in line. The Gabellotto hired his own private guards, known as campieri. These men were often former bandits themselves, tough, armed, and violent. They were the enforcers of a new private order. They settled disputes, oversaw contracts, and dispensed a brutal form of justice, all outside the purview of the state. In this chaotic transition from feudalism to capitalism, the Gabellotto and his campieri became a parallel government, a state within a state. This new system of private power might have remained a scattered rural phenomenon were it not for a surprising global development, a sudden, insatiable demand for lemons. In the late 18th century, the British physician James Lind discovered that citrus fruits could prevent and cure scurvy, the disease that had long plagued sailors on extended voyages. By the early 1800s, the British Royal Navy was issuing millions of gallons of lemon juice to its fleet. Demand exploded, and Sicily, with its uniquely fertile volcanic soil and hot coastal plains, was one of the few places in the world that could meet it. Previously an aristocratic symbol used for perfumes and decoration, the lemon became liquid gold. Between 1837 and 1850, exports of lemon juice from the port of Messina increased nearly 30-fold. By the 1880s, 2.5 million cases of Italian citrus were arriving in New York City every year, most of them from Palermo. This citrus boom created immense wealth, but it also created immense vulnerability. Lemon groves were a high-risk, high-reward investment. The trees were sensitive, required constant watering, and took years to bear fruit. A ripe grove was an irresistible target for thieves and bandits. A single night's raid could wipe out years of investment, with the official state unable to provide security. The wealthy grove owners turned to the only people who could, the local strongmen, the Gabellotti and their gangs. This was the birth of the Pizzo, the protection racket that would become the mafia's signature business. It was a simple, brutal proposition. The landowner paid for protection from thieves. But soon, the protectors and the thieves became one and the same. The gangs created the very threat they were being paid to prevent. The case of Dr. Ugo Galati in the 1870s provides a chillingly clear picture of how this worked. A surgeon from Palermo, Galati inherited a lucrative lemon grove, only to discover that its warden, a man of honor, was systematically stealing from him. Galati fired the warden and hired an honest replacement. The new man was promptly shot, though he survived. Galati then received a threatening letter, warning him that if he didn't rehire the original warden, he would face the consequences. The letter was signed, Men of Honor of the District. When Galati went to the local police, he found them unhelpful, even complicit. He realized he was trapped in a system where the criminals, the police, and the local political figures were all intertwined. After further assassination attempts, Dr. Galati was forced to abandon his property and flee Sicily. An Italian government official who later investigated this new criminal phenomenon was so horrified that he wrote, "After you've read enough stories on the crimes these people perpetrated, the fragrance of the citrus blossoms begins to resemble the stench of corpses." These disparate groups of protectors and extortionists, known as Mafia, began to coalesce, particularly in the citrus-rich regions of western Sicily around Palermo. They were not an ancient, romantic order of rebels, but a modern phenomenon born directly from the failures of the new Italian state and the opportunities of global capitalism. They enforced their own brutal justice and began to weave themselves into the fabric of society, intimidating voters to elect politicians who would be in their debt. The name itself, Mafia, soon entered the public consciousness. Its precise origin is unknown. It may derive from a Sicilian Arabic slang expression meaning acting as a protector against the arrogance of the powerful, or it may have been popularized by a hugely successful 1863 play, I Mafiosi della Vicaria, The Heroes of the Penitentiary, about a gang of inmates with their own secret rituals and code of honor. Whatever its origin, the name stuck. By the end of the 19th century, the mafia was no longer just an attitude or a collection of rural gangs. It was a cohesive, violent, and powerful criminal organization, born in the lemon groves, that was poised to extend its shadow far beyond the shores of Sicily. the Iron Prefect, and the American Gamble. By the early 20th century, the Mafia had become so powerful in Sicily that it functioned as a parallel state. It had even been called upon by the government in Rome in the 1870s to help suppress more dangerous, independent criminal bands, an arrangement that was supposed to be temporary but instead allowed the Mafia clans to expand their power and entrench themselves in the island's politics and economy. They were adept at political corruption, delivering blocks of votes for friendly candidates and ensuring that the state looked the other way. This was a situation that Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who seized power in Italy in 1922, could not tolerate. For a man obsessed with absolute authority and the total power of the state, the existence of a rival power in Sicily was an intolerable affront. The story of Mussolini's personal declaration of war on the Mafia has become legendary. In May 1924, Il Duce made a grand propaganda visit to Sicily, accompanied by a formidable military escort. In the town of Piena dei Grisi, he was greeted by the mayor, Don Francesco Cuccia, who was also a local mafia boss. Looking at Mussolini's phalanx of police and bodyguards, Don Cuccia reportedly remarked with a smirk, "You are with me. You are under my protection. What do you need all these cops for?" The insult was profound. A local chieftain was offering protection to the absolute dictator of Italy. Furious and humiliated, Mussolini refused the mayor's hospitality. In retaliation, Cuccia instructed the townspeople to boycott Mussolini's public address. The dictator spoke to an empty square. While this personal slight may have been the catalyst, the political motivation was far deeper. Mussolini could not build his totalitarian state while another shadowy power held sway over a part of his country. The Mafia had to be crushed. To wage this war, Mussolini unleashed Cesare Mori, a hard-nosed, retired police officer with previous experience in Sicily. Mori was appointed prefect of Palermo in October 1925 and given a simple, terrifying mandate: eradicate the Mafia by any means necessary. In a telegram, Mussolini gave him carte blanche. The authority of the state must absolutely be re-established in Sicily. If the laws still in force hinder you, this will be no problem. We will draw up new laws. Mori became known as the Iron Prefect, and he lived up to the name. His campaign was not one of policing, but of military subjugation. His goal was to demonstrate, in the most brutal terms possible, that the fascist state was more powerful and more ruthless than the Mafia. Mori's forces, a small army of policemen, carabinieri, and militiamen, swept through Mafia-controlled towns. They conducted mass arrests, eventually rounding up over 11,000 suspects. They used torture to extract confessions, took the families of fugitives hostage, and publicly slaughtered their livestock to force them to surrender. In January 1926, Mori undertook his most famous action, the siege of Ganji, a mountain village and notorious Mafia stronghold. His forces surrounded the town, cutting off water and communication, and went house to house, arresting hundreds. Mori's methods were designed to shatter the Mafia's prestige and break the system of mediation that gave it power. He wanted to forge a direct bond between the Sicilian people and the state, proving that the Mafia could no longer protect them. For a time, it seemed to work. The murder rate in Sicily plummeted. Many mafiosi were imprisoned, while others fled, many to the United States. In 1929, Mussolini recalled Mori to Rome, and the fascist propaganda machine triumphantly declared that the Mafia had been defeated. The story then shifts dramatically to 1943. The Allies, having won in North Africa, were planning their invasion of Europe, starting with Sicily, the continent's soft underbelly. It is here that one of the most enduring and controversial chapters in the Mafia's history begins, the story of its alleged collaboration with the Allied forces. The legend, fueled for decades by rumors and sensational accounts, centers on one of the most powerful mobsters in America, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano, the father of the modern American Mafia, was serving a long prison sentence in New York. The story goes that U.S. naval intelligence, deeply concerned about potential Axis sabotage on the New York docks, struck a deal with the imprisoned boss in a secret program called Operation Underworld. In exchange for a commuted sentence, Luciano would use his influence to secure the waterfront. More importantly, he would leverage his deep connections to the Sicilian underworld to aid the Allied invasion, codenamed Operation Husky. According to the myth, Sicilian mafiosi provided the Allies with crucial intelligence, maps of harbors, and photographs of the coastline. They supposedly guided American troops through mountain passes and eliminated Italian snipers. Some tales even claim that Allied vehicles displayed a yellow flag with a black L for Luciano to identify themselves to their mafia allies on the ground. However, the truth is far more complex and, in many ways, more damning. Most serious historians today have largely debunked the idea of a direct, coordinated pact with the mafia during the invasion itself. The Allied military was a massive, overwhelming force that did not need the mafia's help to secure a beachhead. Luciano's actual contribution was likely limited to facilitating intelligence gathering from the Italian-American community in New York. The legend of his grand role was a useful myth, perhaps even spread by his own associates to burnish his reputation and justify his eventual parole and deportation. The focus on this dramatic but largely unsubstantiated story obscures the far more significant and destructive reality of what happened. After the invasion, as the Allies advanced, they established the Allied Military Government of Occupied Territories, or AMGOT, to administer the island. They needed to quickly replace thousands of fascist mayors and officials with reliable, non-fascist locals. In their haste and driven by a pragmatic anti-communist agenda, they turned to the very men Mussolini had imprisoned. The mafiosi, persecuted by the fascist regime, presented themselves as political dissidents and victims of dictatorship. The Allies, seeing them as natural allies against both the remnants of fascism and the rising threat of communism, released them from prison and, in many cases, appointed them to positions of power. Prominent mafia bosses like Calogero Vizzini and Giuseppe Genco Russo were installed as mayors of their hometowns. In a supreme and tragic irony, the forces that had liberated Sicily from one form of totalitarianism had effectively handed the keys to the island back to another. Cesare Mori's brutal suppression was undone in a matter of months. The mafia was not just back. It was legitimized, empowered, and woven into the new political fabric of post-war Sicily. The heroin empire, reborn and politically empowered after the Allied invasion, the Sicilian Mafia wasted no time in capitalizing on its new status. The post-war era saw the organization transform from a largely rural, land-based power into a sophisticated, urban, and global criminal enterprise. Its first major venture was to seize control of the post-war Reconstruction boom, particularly in Palermo. This period became known as the Sack of Palermo. With their allies in municipal government, men like Vito Ciancimino, a corrupt politician born in the mafia heartland of Corleone, the clans took control of the city's building sector. Between 1959 and 1963, over 80% of the 4,000 building permits issued in Palermo were granted to just 5 men, all frontmen for the mafia with no background in construction. The beautiful Conca d'Oro, the golden shell valley of citrus and olive groves that surrounded the city, was systematically bulldozed. Historic villas and aristocratic palaces were torn down, often with permits granted in a single day, to make way for shoddily constructed, anonymous concrete apartment blocks. This construction frenzy served 2 purposes. It generated enormous, legitimate profits for mafia-owned companies and provided the perfect mechanism for laundering the proceeds of their other, illicit activities. While the mafia was cementing its control over Palermo's economy, it was also setting its sights on a far more lucrative international market: heroin. The American mafia, its powerful offshoot born from Sicilian emigration, had long been involved in narcotics. The Sicilian clans, with their deep connections on both sides of the Atlantic, were perfectly positioned to enter the trade. The groundwork was laid at a legendary, almost mythical, meeting in October 1957 at the Grand Hotel Et de Palms in Palermo. Top American bosses, including Joseph Bonanno and Carmine Galante, met with the elite of the Sicilian Mafia, figures like Salvatore Littlebird Greco and Gaetano Badalamenti. While the precise agreements made in the hotel's opulent rooms remain the subject of debate, with some key figures like Pentito Tommaso Buscetta later denying a formal summit ever took place. the outcome was clear. This meeting established a formal partnership for the Sicilian Mafia to enter the transatlantic heroin trade. At the time, the main supply route to the United States was the so-called French Connection, a network controlled by Corsican gangs based in Marseille who imported morphine base from Turkey, refined it into heroin in French labs, and smuggled it to New York. The Sicilians initially acted as junior partners in this lucrative enterprise. By the early 1970s, however, coordinated Franco-American police efforts began to successfully dismantle the French Connection. This created a massive vacuum in the global heroin market, and the Sicilian Mafia, now rich with capital from the sack of Palermo and with its international networks firmly in place, moved decisively to fill it. This was the birth of the Pizza Connection, one of the most sophisticated and profitable drug trafficking operations in history. It was a fully integrated global monopoly. The mafia sourced morphine base from the poppy fields of Turkey and Southwest Asia. This base was then smuggled to Sicily, where a network of clandestine high-tech laboratories refined it into pure heroin. From Sicily, the finished product was shipped to the United States. The distribution network was ingenious and audacious. The heroin was funneled to consumers, and the immense profits laundered through a sprawling web of seemingly legitimate mafia-owned pizzerias across the American Northeast and Midwest. Cash was moved through a complex shadow system of international banks and brokerage firms. Between 1979 and 1984 alone, this network was estimated to have smuggled 1,650 pounds of heroin into the U.S., with a street value of an astonishing $1.65 billion. This colossal influx of drug money fundamentally changed the nature of Cosa Nostra, but it also created unprecedented internal tensions. The sheer scale of the profits dwarfed anything that could be earned from traditional rackets like extortion and sparked ferocious competition. This tension first exploded in the First Mafia War of 1962 to 1963, a brutal conflict in Palermo for control of the burgeoning rackets. The war culminated in the Sicilian Massacre of June 1963, when a car bomb, intended for the boss Salvatore Little Bird Greco, instead killed 7 police and military officers who were attempting to defuse it. The public outrage was immense, forcing the Italian state to launch its first major crackdown since the fascist era. An anti-mafia commission was formed, and hundreds of mafiosi were arrested. The subsequent trials were largely a failure, with most defendants acquitted due to intimidated witnesses and a legal system not yet equipped to prosecute a secret society. However, the crackdown was enough to disrupt the organization and drive it back into the shadows for a time. But the seeds of conflict had been sown. The heroin trade had created a new generation of mafiosi, younger and more ruthless, who saw the astronomical profits as their birthright. This internal struggle between the old guard and the new, ambitious players would soon erupt into a war that would dwarf the first, a war that would drench Sicily in blood and forever change the face of the mafia. The Matanza, the rise of the Corleonesi. The story of the Sicilian Mafia in the latter half of the 20th century is the story of Corleone. Not the romanticized town of fiction, but a real place. A hard, rocky, impoverished town in the Sicilian interior that bred a new and uniquely savage strain of mafioso. These men, the Corleonesi, were often dismissed by the sophisticated, urban bosses of Palermo as Vidani, peasants. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Corleonesi were driven by a bottomless ambition and a capacity for violence that even other mafiosi found shocking. Their rise to absolute power was a hostile takeover, a campaign of extermination so brutal it became known as the Matanza, the Italian word for the bloody, ritual slaughter of tuna. Their path was forged by Luciano Leggio. Born into extreme poverty, Leggio was a small-time cattle thief who murdered his way to the top. At 18, he killed the man who reported him for stealing corn. Recruited as an enforcer for the Corleone family boss, Dr. Michel Navarra, Leggio quickly grew tired of taking orders. In 1958, he and a team of 14 gunmen, including his young protégés, ambushed Navarra's car, riddling the doctor's body with almost 100 bullets. Leggio seized control of the Corleone family and set it on a course of ruthless expansion. He was finally captured in 1974 and would spend the rest of his life in prison, but not before he had unleashed his hand-picked successors on the world. His chief lieutenant was Salvatore Rina, nicknamed Toto u Curtu, Toto the Short, for his stature, and La Belva, the Beast, for his nature. Rina was the embodiment of Corleonese brutality, cunning, pathologically violent, and possessing an insatiable hunger for power. He took control of the clan after Leggio's imprisonment. At his side was Bernardo Provenzano. In his youth, he was known as Binu Tratturi, Bernie the Tractor, for the brutal way he mowed down his enemies. Later, he would become Il Ragionier, the accountant, the quiet, calculating strategist to Rina's overt savagery. Together, this triumvirate of peasant killers would orchestrate the bloodiest chapter in the Mafia's history. The Second Mafia War began in earnest on April 23, 1981. The target was Stefano Bontad, one of the most powerful and respected bosses in Palermo, a leader of the established faction that controlled the lucrative heroin trade. He was gunned down with an AK-47 as he returned home from his birthday party. Less than 3 weeks later, his close ally, Salvatore Inzerillo, was also murdered. This was the opening salvo of the Matanza. It was not a war between rival factions. It was a systematic purge. Rina's death squads, led by merciless killers like Giuseppe Scarpuzzetta Greco, fanned out across Sicily and beyond. They didn't just kill the rival bosses. They hunted down and murdered their brothers, their sons, their uncles, and their cousins, violating the long-held mafia taboo against harming a man's relatives. Between 1981 and 1983, over 1,000 people were killed, a rate of almost one murder a day. Victims were shot, strangled, and dissolved in acid. The war extended to America, where Inzerillo's brother was found in the trunk of a car in New Jersey with dollar bills stuffed in his mouth and genitals. A grim message about his greed. The Corleonese's victory was total and absolute. Their success was built on a foundation of natural secrecy and unparalleled ruthlessness. They formed clandestine alliances with other families, using them to isolate their primary targets, and then, once their rivals were eliminated, they turned on their own allies, killing them to consolidate their power and ensure no one was left who could challenge them. By the end of 1982, the great Palermo families were decimated. The surviving members either fled or swore allegiance to the new masters of Corleone. The old mafia, a loose federation of powerful families governed by a commission, the cupola which balanced competing interests, was dead. Rina had destroyed it. In its place, he had built a dictatorship. The cupola still existed, but it was now merely a rubber stamp for his will. Through terror and bloodshed, the peasants from Corleone had seized control of Cosa Nostra and its billion-dollar heroin empire. Salvatore Rina was now the undisputed boss of all bosses, and his reign of terror had only just begun. The state strikes back. As Toto Rina consolidated his dictatorship over Cosa Nostra, his violence spilled out from the underworld and crashed against the Italian state itself. Believing he was invincible, Rina unleashed a campaign of terror designed to intimidate and paralyze the authorities. The targets were the so-called cadaveri excellenti, excellent cadavers, high-profile figures of the state who dared to stand in his way. He ordered the murders of crusading politicians like Piersanti Mattarella, the president of the Sicilian region, and Pio La Torre, a communist leader who was pushing for a new law to make mafia conspiracy a specific crime. He eliminated top police investigators like Boris Giuliano. He assassinated magistrates like Rocco Chinichi and Cesare Terranova. The most audacious attack came on September 3, 1982. General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, a national hero who had defeated the Red Brigade's left-wing terrorist group, was sent to Palermo as the city's new prefect with special powers to crush the mafia. Just 100 days after his arrival, his car was ambushed on a Palermo street. The general, his young wife, and his police escort were all gunned down. The murder of a figure of Dalla Chiesa's stature sent a shockwave of outrage across Italy. At his funeral, furious Sicilians jeered and spat on the government ministers in attendance, blaming them for tolerating the mafia for so long. The state, shamed into action, was finally forced to get serious. In the beleaguered Palermo courthouse, a new strategy was taking shape. Judge Rocco Chinichi, before his own assassination in 1983, had created an informal anti-mafia pool, a group of investigating magistrates who would work together, sharing information and assuming collective responsibility for cases. The goal was to break the mafia's tactic of isolating and eliminating a single heroic prosecutor. After Chinichi's murder by car bomb, his successor, Antonino Capinetto, formalized the pool. It was led by two men who had grown up as childhood friends in the same Palermo neighborhood, playing football together while other friends were being drawn into the mob: Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. The pool's historic breakthrough came from a man who embodied the old mafia that Rina had destroyed. Tommaso Buscetta, known as Don Massino, was a high-ranking mafioso from a prestigious Palermo family. He had fled to Brazil to escape the Matanza, but Rina's assassins had hunted down and murdered many of his relatives and allies, including two of his sons, who were strangled and dissolved in acid. In 1984, Buscetta was arrested in Sao Paulo and extradited to Italy. Faced with a certain death sentence from Rina, and disgusted by how the Corleonesi had twisted and corrupted the honorable society he had once believed in, Buscetta made a momentous decision. He would break Omerta. He would talk, for 45 days in a secure location. Tommaso Buscetta sat across from Giovanni Falcone and laid bare the entire secret world of Cosa Nostra. He explained its structure, its initiation rituals, its codes, and its functions. Most critically, he revealed for the first time the existence and workings of the Cupola, the Sicilian Mafia commission that served as its board of directors and Supreme Court. This was the Buscetta theorem, the revelation that Cosa Nostra was a single, unified, hierarchical organization. This meant that the bosses who sat on the commission were responsible for every crime committed in its name, whether they pulled the trigger or not. It was the legal key Falcone had been searching for, the weapon he needed to put the entire organization on trial. Armed with Buscetta's testimony, and that of other pentiti turncoats, like Salvatore Contorno who followed his lead, the anti-mafia pool constructed the most ambitious prosecution in legal history. The Maxi trial began on February 10, 1986. The spectacle was staggering. It was held in a specially constructed, octagonal, bomb-proof bunker courthouse built inside the walls of Palermo's Uxiordone prison. Inside, 475 mafiosi sat in steel cages, facing a tribunal of judges and a jury of their peers. Hundreds of lawyers, journalists, and police officers packed the courtroom. For nearly 2 years, the trial unfolded, a dramatic public dissection of a secret society. On December 16, 1987, the verdict came down. It was a stunning victory for the state. 338 defendants were convicted, sentenced to a combined 2,665 years in prison. 19 of the top bosses, including the fugitives Rina and Provenzano, were sentenced to life. The mafia appealed, as it always did, expecting the verdicts to be overturned by pliable judges in Rome. But the climate had changed. On January 30, 1992, the Italian Supreme Court upheld the convictions, making them final. For the first time, the state had won an undeniable historic victory. The existence of Cosa Nostra was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a judicially confirmed fact. But the beast, still lurking in the shadows, was about to unleash its final, apocalyptic roar. The season of bombs and the long silence. The Supreme Court's decision on January 30, 1992, was a declaration of war. For Toto Rina, it was an act of ultimate betrayal. He had long relied on his political connections, particularly within the ruling Christian Democracy Party, to fix trials and quash convictions at the highest levels. The confirmation of the Maxi trial sentences was an unforgivable failure by his political protectors. Enraged, and with the arrogance of a man who believed himself more powerful than the state, Rina decided to strike back, to attack the state at its very core. His first target was the architect of his defeat, Giovanni Falcone. The planning for the assassination was chillingly meticulous. A team of Corleonesi killers, led by one of Rina's most brutal hitmen, Giovanni Brusca, a man so vicious he was nicknamed Uveru, the pig, identified a vulnerable point on the A29 motorway, the stretch of highway connecting Palermo's airport to the city. They dug into a drainage culvert running beneath the road and packed it with 13 drums of explosives, nearly half a ton of TNT and Semtex, a payload powerful enough to obliterate a bridge. On the afternoon of May 23, 1992, Falcone's convoy of 3 armored Fiat Chromas left the airport. Brusca and his team watched from a nearby hillside, armed with a remote control detonator. As the cars entered the kill zone, Brusca pressed the button. The explosion was apocalyptic. It ripped a massive crater in the motorway, and the blast was so powerful it registered on local seismographs. The lead car was vaporized, instantly killing the 3 police escorts inside: Antonio Montanaro, Vito Scafani, and Rocco DiCillo. Falcone's car slammed into the wall of rubble and concrete. The judge and his wife, Francesca Morvillo, were killed. Back in Palermo, as news of the attack spread, Toto Riina and his men reportedly celebrated with champagne. The nation was plunged into grief and rage, but the Mafia's war was not over. Falcone's closest friend and colleague, Paolo Borsellino, knew he was next. He worked tirelessly for 57 days, racing against time to piece together what he could from Falcone's investigations, knowing his own life was forfeit. On July 19, 1992, the Mafia came for him. A Fiat 126, stolen and packed with TNT, was parked on Via D'Amelio, outside the apartment building where Borsellino's mother lived. As the judge and his escort approached the entrance, the bomb was detonated. The blast was immense, killing Borsellino and 5 of his police escorts: Agostino Catalano, Emanuela Loi, Vincenzo Limuli, Walter Cassina, and Claudio Traina. Emanuela Loi was the first female police officer in Italy to be killed in the line of duty. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino were Riina's greatest strategic blunder. He believed that by assassinating the state's most potent symbols, he could terrify it into submission. He fundamentally misunderstood the power of public opinion in a democracy. Instead of submission, he provoked a wave of revulsion and fury unlike anything Italy had ever seen. The funerals were broadcast live on national television. In Palermo, furious crowds broke through police lines, jeering and spitting on the government ministers in attendance, screaming "shame" and blaming them for abandoning the judges. Across the city, and then across Italy, white sheets began to appear on balconies, a silent protest bearing the words, "You did not kill them. Their ideas walk on our legs." Galvanized by this unprecedented public pressure, the Italian state finally unleashed its full might. The army was deployed to Sicily, thousands of soldiers patrolling the streets. A new, tougher anti-mafia law was passed, and the hunt for the fugitives intensified. On January 15, 1993, the state had its revenge. Acting on a tip from an informant, the Carabinieri cornered and arrested Toto Riina in the heart of Palermo. The beast was finally in chains. With Riina and the most violent Corleonesi leaders captured, a new era began under the quiet leadership of Bernardo Provenzano. Provenzano was a brilliant strategist who had witnessed Riina's catastrophic miscalculation firsthand. He understood that the strategy of open warfare, of spectacular bombings and high-profile assassinations, had been a disaster for Cosa Nostra. He instituted a new, far more insidious strategy known as la submersion, the submersion. The Mafia would go silent. It would disappear from the headlines, renounce the bombings, and retreat into the shadows. The new focus would be on the less visible but equally profitable work of business infiltration, corruption, and political collusion. For decades, Provenzano ran the entire organization from a series of squalid rural farmhouses near Corleone, communicating only through tiny, coded notes called pizzini that were painstakingly passed through a network of couriers. He was a ghost, the ultimate fugitive, until his own capture in 2006, when police tracked a package of clean laundry from his wife's house to his final hideout. The symbolic end of the Corleonesi era came on January 16, 2023, with the arrest of the last great fugitive from the season of bombs, Matteo Messina Denaro. After 30 years on the run, he was captured at a private health clinic in Palermo, where he was receiving treatment for cancer under a false name. The age of the godfathers, of the all-powerful, murderous bosses who waged war on the state, was finally over. Cosa Nuova. The capture of Matteo Messina Denaro marked the end of an era, but not the end of the Sicilian Mafia. Cosa Nostra today is a shadow of its former self, its power diminished, its mystique shattered, but it is far from dead. It has done what it has always done. It has adapted. The strategy of submersion, initiated by Bernardo Provenzano, has proven remarkably effective for survival. The modern mafia has largely abandoned the spectacular violence that once defined it and has shifted its focus to the more insidious and profitable world of economic infiltration. The core business is no longer just the pizzo, the extortion of local businesses, though that certainly continues. The primary activity is now the infiltration of the legal economy. The mafia uses its vast illicit wealth to take over legitimate companies, particularly in sectors like construction, waste management, tourism, food retailing, and, more recently, green energy. These companies provide a steady stream of clean revenue and serve as perfect vehicles for laundering the proceeds from their continued involvement in the international drug trade. The organization has also embraced the digital age, using cryptocurrencies and NFTs to obscure the origins of its wealth and evade the scrutiny of banks and law enforcement. This evolution makes the modern mafia a far more complex and difficult target. It is less a gang of thugs to be fought in the streets and more a parasitic financial entity to be untangled from the legitimate economy. There are even signs of an internal crisis, a generational gap where the old guard laments a recruitment crisis, complaining that new members lack the discipline, loyalty, and ambition of their predecessors, preferring small-time dealing to building empires. In response, the Italian state has honed its most effective weapon: asset confiscation. Building on the work of pioneers like Pio La Torre and Giovanni Falcone, Italy has enacted powerful laws that allow the state to seize assets and businesses whose value is disproportionate to a person's declared income, shifting the burden of proof onto the suspect. A dedicated government body, the ANBSC, now manages thousands of confiscated properties and companies, with the goal of repurposing them for social use and returning them to the community. This strategy strikes the mafia not just in its wallet, but at the very source of its power and territorial control. Perhaps the most profound change, however, has not come from the state, but from the people. The revulsion that followed the 1992 bombings gave birth to a powerful, grassroots anti-mafia movement within Sicilian civil society. The most prominent example is Addio Pizzo, Goodbye Pizzo. The movement was started in 2004 by a group of young friends in Palermo who wanted to open a bar but were unwilling to pay the traditional protection money. They began by plastering the city with stickers that mimicked funeral notices, bearing a simple, powerful message. A whole people who pays the pizzo is a people without dignity. Their core strategy is critical consumption. They encourage business owners to refuse to pay the pizzo and join their network. In return, they promote these businesses to a community of consumers who pledge to support only pizzo-free establishments. This creates a circle of solidarity, breaking the isolation and fear that the mafia has always used to control its victims. It is a collective fight where the simple act of choosing where to buy groceries becomes an act of defiance. The story of the Sicilian Mafia is a dark and bloody thread woven through the fabric of modern Italian history. It is a chilling lesson in how a vacuum of power, the failures of a state, and the perverse incentives of a globalized economy can give birth to a monster. The era of the Corleonesi, of open warfare and excellent cadavers, is over. The godfathers are dead or in chains, but the organization remains quieter, more subtle, and deeply embedded in the economic and political life of the island. Yet, in the streets of Palermo and across Sicily, a new story is being written. It is a story told not with bullets and bombs, but with shop window decals, consumer choices, and the courage of ordinary people organizing to reclaim their land and their dignity. The fight against Cosa Nostra is no longer just a matter for police and prosecutors. It has become a cultural battle, a slow, determined uprising against the culture of fear. And in that collective courage lies the greatest hope for Sicily's future.